Well, welcome back to Theology in Perspective. I'm Dr. Daniel Woodhead, president of the Scofield Biblical Institute and Theological Seminary, and I'm blessed that you could join us again today. If you've been with us in our last session, you know that we're studying the changing geography of the nation Israel and how it has changed substantially from what God gave the Jews initially in the Abrahamic covenant and in the books of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, and what they have right now and how that has changed over time. Now, we've gotten to the point in our study where we looked at the war for independence after the United Nations decreed that the nation Israel should be established at the end of the Second World War. So there was a massive amount of fighting that took place after the Declaration of Independence in May of 1948. From the north, they were invaded by the Lebanese and the Syrians. From the east, they were invaded by the Iraqis, the Saudi Arabians, and the Jordanians. And then from the south, they were invaded by the Egyptians. They beat back every one of those entities against all odds. They survived, and all they had to fight with was World War I weaponry that was provided to them by the Czechoslovakians. So they've established their state. They now have peace, and I want to look at a map called the Arab Refugees of 1948. So at that time, there were approximately 720,000 Arabs that were encouraged by their leaders to leave Israel. And they wanted them to flee, which was now Israel, because the state had been declared, again, both United Nations and then the declaration of the Israelis. Between April and December of 1948, the Arab leaders promised these people that they'd soon be able to return following Israel's destruction, because they were certain they were going to destroy Israel, even though they'd lost miserably. The Arabs had lost miserably in that war. In some cases, the Jews, including Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, urged the Arabs to remain, and they promised them that they wouldn't be harmed. Those that did remain became full and equal citizens of the new state of Israel. Those who chose to leave were offered the opportunity to go to any of the neighboring Arab states. So instead of welcoming their Arab brothers and integrating them into the mainstream of their societies, the Arab states kept them in squalid refugee camps and used these so-called Palestinian refugees, as they were now being called, as political pawns against their fight in Israel. So they were headquartered and squished together in these refugee camps in Israel. And those refugee camps became pressure cookers for unrest and violence. The Arabs lied to them about the Israelis trying to keep them out. The Israelis said, you can go if you want to. And the Israelis said, if you want to stay, you become a full citizen here under our Constitution, and you won't be harmed. Well, let's look at this next map here, the Jewish refugees that were in the Arab states. Now, this map actually has a timeline that runs from 1948 until all the way to 1972. So look at this map here, and you can see that in 1945, there were more than 870,000 Jews living in various Arab states. And in many of their communities, these Jewish communities dated back 2,500 years. Throughout 1947 and 1948, these Jews were persecuted. Their property and their belongings were confiscated. There were anti-Jewish riots in Aden, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Iraq. In Iraq, Zionism was made a capital crime, punishable by death. Approximately 600,000 Jews sought refuge in the state of Israel. They arrived destitute, but they were absorbed into the society and became an integral part of the Free State of Israel. In effect, then, a veritable exchange of populations took place between Arab and Jewish refugees. Now, while the Jewish refugees became full Israeli citizens, the Arab refugees remained refugees according to the wishes of the Arab leaders. And I have to tell you, if you want to read anything about this in great detail with all the United Nations decrees, get Joan Peters' book, From Time Immemorial. Now, she wrote this book, and it is just excellent. She was contracted to write the book to find out about the problem of these poor Palestinian refugees. And she went back to the publisher and she said, I can't write your book because these are not poor people. These are the Israelis are the ones that are getting marginalized here. And they said, that's a better story. Write that. Good book, From Time Immemorial. So let's look at our next map here, and that is the Fedayeen raids between 1951 and 1956. Having lost in battle what they could have had in the peace were envisioned by the 1947 partition plan, Palestinian Arab terrorist groups called the Fedayeen, they began systematic raids against the Israeli civilian population. 1,300 Israelis were killed and wounded by Arab terrorists between 1949 and 1956. And now these Fedayeen operated from a base located and controlled in Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. Okay, now let's fast forward a bit here to the 1956 Sinai campaign. This was the next, it was just a massive effort by the Egyptians to keep the Israelis in a state of economic ill, if you will. So, in September of 1955, in violation of international agreements and in what amounted to an act of war, Egypt sealed off access to the Israeli port of Eilat. Now, that effectively stopped Israel's sea trade with much of Africa and the Far East. Then, on July the 26th of 1956, Nasser, the president of Egypt, announced Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal, most of whose shares were held by Britain and France. Now, you have to understand the importance of the Suez Canal. Without being able to go from the Mideast to the Mediterranean and get to other parts of the world, you would have to go around Africa. The cost would be exponentially higher, and you were going to have a lot more time to get your products to market. So, with diplomacy failing from France and Britain and Israel to reverse Nasser's decision, Britain and France, they just embarked on preparations to regain control of the canal. And on October the 26th of 1956, together with Israel, they launched military operations in the Sinai Peninsula. 4.5 months later, on March the 16th of 1957, Israel withdrew her troops from the Sinai and the Gaza Strip after receiving international reassurances that Israel's vital waterways are going to remain open. I mean, these waterways are vital for their economic well-being. So 3,300 United Nations troops replaced them. Despite Israel's withdrawal, the Egyptians refused to open the Suez Canal to Israeli shipping. Israeli shipping, can you imagine? So this put a massive damper on the Israeli economy. Now remember, they would have to go around Cape of Good Hope in Africa to get anything to market, and the cost goes way, way up. And the time to get things to market is exponentially higher. So this map here shows us the position of Arab forces as of May 1967. During the months of 1966, it became really clear that Israel's neighbors were escalating activities against her. And again, more and more Israeli civilians were killed in attacks coming from the Syrian and the Jordanian borders. The Syrians from up above the Golan Heights shelled Israel's towns indiscriminately. And on May the 15th of 1967, the Egyptian forces moved into the Sinai. On May the 18th, Egypt expelled the U.S. peacekeeping forces from Israel's border. On the 22nd, the Egyptians closed the Straits of Tiran to Israel shipping. And on the 25th, they encouraged Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia move their troops to Israel's border. Just the same thing that happened in 1948. So 2 days later, on the 26th of May, President Nasser of Egypt declared, now pay attention to this because this is right out of the newspaper, our basic goal is the destruction of Israel. The Arab people want to fight. The mining of Sharm el-Sheikh is a confrontation with Israel. Now, these are facts, folks. This is not some rhetoric that we have pulled out of some obscure newspaper. These were published worldwide in the newspapers, 1956, 1957. So, modeled after the November 1966 Egyptian-Syrian Defense Pact, other pacts were signed by Egypt and Jordan and Iraq on May the 30th and June the 4th, thereby completing the encirclement of Israel. And ironically, Egypt moved in part as was in a reaction to false Soviet information passed to Syria, according to which Israel had mobilized forces on her border with Syria in preparation for invasion of Syria. Now, if you want more information on that, I get a history of Israel by Aaron Bregman. It's published by Mulgrave Macmillan. And there's a full text of his speech in there, It is just incredible what these folks did. Nasser's speech is was completely published in the newspapers. So for in preparation for the next one, now this was a big one, the 1967 war, because the tensions started mounting for the next 9 years, and with the Straits of Tiran blocked, the Arab armies poised to strike, Israel decided on June the 5th of 1967 to launch a preemptive attack on the massive Egyptian forces that were aimed at her. Now, within 90 minutes, the backbone of the Egyptian Air Force was broken, and by the end of the day, the first day of the war, 298 Egyptian airplanes were destroyed. Backed by complete air superiority, the Israeli Army divisions then thrust into the Sinai Desert, and they approached the bank of the Suez Canal. At the same time, Israel issued an appeal to Jordan, stay out of the war. Jordan refused and opened a heavy artillery barrage on West Jerusalem and the Tel Aviv area. Now that forced the Israelis to counterattack. By June the 8th, the Israeli Defense Forces had defeated the Jordanian forces and captured the whole Judea and Samaria, that they're calling the West Bank now, but the Israelis don't call it that. On the morning of June the 9th, Israel attacked the Syrians, and they captured the Golan Heights. From these heights, Syria had shelled and destroyed 205 houses, 175 acres of orchards, and 75 acres of grain. The 6 days of fierce fighting ended in Israel's occupation of the Sinai Desert, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights, and what they called the West Bank now, providing Israel's cities with a much-needed buffer zone on both areas, north and south and east. And this has dramatically reduced the danger of extinction by a surprise Arab attack. Furthermore, victory had a special religious meaning because of the unification of Jerusalem and the return of the Jews to Judea and Samaria. That's part of biblical Israel. Now, if you want to have a good account of this, look up the history of Israel by Sachar, Sachar, and he's got a great amount of information about this. I want to touch on the weaponry here that's on your map. Egypt had 270,000 soldiers, 1,400 tanks, and 550 jets. And I'll just leave you to see the rest of that data. The next highest was Iraq with 75,000 soldiers, 630 tanks, and 200 jets. They were all wiped out. Every one of them by little Israel. Every one of them by little Israel. Now, this is an interesting map here. Within 6 days, as we said, the Israelis had captured the entire Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, Judea, Samaria, and the Golan Heights. Now, let's look at what these ceasefire lines are. This time, however, Israel did not withdraw to the 1949 armistice lines. So everything in the green on this map is what they had won on this 1967 Six-Day War. International guarantees had proven meaningless to them in the past and could not provide any security to Israeli citizens and the Arabs that were living there too. They were citizens. Now, the ceasefire lines of 67 shown on this map here remained Israel's border until 1973. The terrorist raids from Egypt ended, and the other raids from Jordan and Syria greatly diminished because of all the property. Now, they got the Sinai, Gaza, Golan Heights, and all of Jerusalem. Let's look at the next map here, which I'm calling the War of Attrition. And in March of 1969, still humiliated by the 1967 defeat, Egypt launched a war of attrition, or an attack, against the Israeli forces in the Sinai, with intense artillery fighting against Israel's, what was known then as the Bar-Lev line. It was on the east bank of the Suez Canal. And after heightened losses in May and June and July of 1969, Israel responded with air raids into Egypt. Nasser, he just responded by appealing to the Soviet Union for help. And on March the 19th, 1970, the Soviet installed missile batteries in Egypt near the Suez Canal. Now, not only did Moscow help supply weapons, but they also operated some and took a direct part in fighting Israel. Now, there was intense U.S. pressure, led to a ceasefire on August the 7th, 1970. That ended up being called the Rogers Plan B, with plans to put in effect the U.S. force Plan for Peace in the region. That was Rogers Plan A, based on a land for peace, which never works, and this is the first instance of that. However, the ceasefire, which called for a freeze on the situation in the canal, was breached by Egypt's movement forward, and forces the same day came into effect. So Israel responded by suspending her participation in the negotiations until the situation, which had prevailed on the eve of the signing of the ceasefire agreement, was restored. So the peace plan was never implemented. Let's look at the War of 1973. That October War began shortly after midday on Saturday, October the 6th, 1973. And look at this map here, and you can see how much they're getting attacked. Egypt and Syria launched a concerted surprise military attack on Israel on the highest holy day of the year, Yom Kippur, when most of the Israelis were in synagogues praying and fasting. And due to the advantage of surprise, Egypt succeeded in crossing the Suez Canal on October the 7th, and the Syrian forces advanced in the north on the Golan Heights. By October the 10th, however, after heavy losses, Israeli forces succeeded in reversing the tide of the battle in the north, and during the next 3 days, Israeli forces advanced 10 kilometers beyond the 1967 ceasefire lines into Syrian territory. In the south, on the Egyptian front, the Israeli forces succeeded in crossing the canal on the 14th and surrounded the Egyptian Third Army. The fighting continued until a ceasefire agreement on the 22nd of October was initiated, and it almost brought the USSR and the USA into confrontation. Because now what you've got is the Soviets, which became the Russians, supporting the Arab states, and the United States supporting Israel. Two superpowers coming together there. Finally, on the 26th of October, the U.S. Soviet-sponsored Security Council resolution was calling for a ceasefire, was just accepted by all the parties, and talks between Egypt and Israel, with active participation of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, it continued on for about 2 months, and it concentrated on Israeli withdrawal to post-Six-Day War lines. That's in 1967. The problem of the encircled Third Army and the exchange of prisoners was an issue that had to be dealt with. Now, Israel agreed to withdraw to 20 kilometers from the canal, and the size of both armies was reduced, and a disengagement agreement was signed between Israel and Egypt on January the 18th of 74. The negotiations with Syria took a whole lot longer, and the mutual fire continued throughout the spring of 74. Finally, on May the 31st of 74, they did sign an agreement with Syria, and Israel returned parts of the Syrian town of Quneitra, and a UN buffer zone was established as the as in the case of the Israeli-Egyptian agreement. A U.S. memorandum of understanding was given to Israel. Now, in order to deceive the Israelis, Egypt embarked on a frequent false mobilization of forces prior to the attack on October the 6th. Syria really wanted the Golan Heights, and they joined with Egypt in preparations for the surprise attack. Israeli intelligence leaders were not alarmed by Egypt's steps, and they strongly adhered to what later became known as the Conception, which was their assessment that Egypt would not embark on a war against Israel until it would have obtained advanced fighter bombers and Scuds. So let's look at this map in a little more detail here. The Egyptian attack, and the attack is just before 2 o'clock on October the 6th. 220 warplanes took off, and they flew on bombing missions against the Israeli military targets. The Syrian attack, 60 warplanes took off from several air bases and attacked them. Now, What we have is this map of the Golan Heights. And there's some pretty important facts here. The Golan Heights, the Golan Heights overlook and therefore militarily control Israel's villages and in cities in the plains and elevations of the north. The heights are roughly the size of the borough of Queens in New York. The width of the whole area is about 15.5 miles at its widest point. And the height control the Kinneret, Israel's only lake and foremost water resources. Now, this map here that I have up, it shows Ariel Sharon's succession in Gaza, West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. Now, they did withdraw from Gaza, and I have to tell you, land that gets given away, land that gets divided, according to Joel chapter 3, is always going to result in God's destruction of those individuals. Ariel Sharon was the prime minister. He gave away the Gaza Strip and tried to give away the West Bank to the Palestinians, and he ended up with a stroke, and he stayed in a vegetative state for his entire life until he passed away. And again, I want you to be aware of the book again, From Time Immemorial by Joan Peters. It's published by Harper and Row, and it discusses in great detail the origin of the Arab and the Israeli armed conflict. Well, God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you in our next session.
We hope you have been blessed by this message today on a contemporarily relevant Bible topic. Dr. Woodhead has been teaching the Bible for 25 years. He is a pastor, an author, and conference speaker on various biblical subjects. Dr. Woodhead is the Dean of the Jewish Studies School at Schofield Seminary. His seminary teaching includes the Old Testament and Biblical Hebrew. He has attended Hebrew University in Jerusalem and Hebrew College in Massachusetts. Please write us at Post Office Box 48, Hart, Michigan 49420. Again, that's Post Office Box 48, Hart, Michigan 49420, or call us at 877-706-2479. That's 877-706-2479. Once again, 877-706-2479. Let us know if you have any questions about today's broadcast. We look forward to providing you with continuing Bible messages each week on this station. God bless you.